Cursed Cassettes presents. I'll never forget the day we moved into our new house. It was one of those perfect suburban neighborhoods, the kind where every lawn is trimmed just right and the neighbors greet you with a wave. For me, it was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where nothing bad ever happened. The house itself was huge compared to our old one, a 2-story, 4-bedroom home with a basement. I was excited, but there was something about the basement that gave me the creeps from the very beginning. It wasn't finished, just bare concrete walls and a cold, damp floor. There was only one small, grimy window near the ceiling that barely let any light in. I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was just a basement, right? About a week after we moved in, weird things started happening. I remember hearing the basement lights flicker on and off at night. I'd be in my room, scrolling through my phone, and suddenly I'd hear this faint buzzing noise from downstairs, like someone was flipping the light switch. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe the wiring was old, or there was a power surge, but it kept happening, night after night. Then one evening, when my parents went out for dinner, things got worse. It was around 9 p.m. I was home alone, binge-watching some random Netflix series. The house was dead silent, except for the muffled sounds from the TV. Suddenly, I heard something, faint but distinct. Footsteps. At first, I thought maybe it was the wind, or maybe one of the neighbors outside. But the sound was coming from inside the house, from the basement. I muted the TV and listened. There it was again. Soft, slow footsteps, like someone pacing back and forth below me. I stood up, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. I told myself it was just my imagination, that there was no way anyone could be down there. But the footsteps grew louder, and they weren't random anymore. They were coming closer, as if whoever it was had stopped pacing and was now walking up the stairs toward the basement door. I stared at the door, my stomach twisting into knots. I could feel the blood pounding in my ears as the handle slowly turned. I froze. There was no way anyone could be down there. My parents always kept the basement locked when we weren't using it, but that night I wasn't so sure. The door creaked open, just a crack. I couldn't see anything beyond the darkness. Terrified, I grabbed my phone and locked myself in my room. I called my parents, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what was happening. My mum tried to calm me down, telling me it was probably just the old house settling, but I could hear the panic in her voice. She said they'd be home in 20 minutes. I sat there, every muscle in my body tense, staring at my bedroom door. I could hear the sound of footsteps again, but this time they weren't in the basement. They were in the hallway, just outside my room. Whoever it was, whatever it was inside the house. I don't know how much time passed. It felt like hours, but it must have been just a few minutes. The footsteps stopped, and I heard the front door open. My parents were finally home. I rushed downstairs to meet them, trying to explain what I'd heard, but they seemed unconvinced. My dad, wanting to prove it was all in my head, grabbed a flashlight and went down to the basement. I followed him, still shaking. We walked down the creaky wooden steps, the dim beam of the flashlight cutting through the darkness. Everything looked normal, just boxes and old furniture. But then, as we were about to head back upstairs, my dad stopped dead in his tracks. I'll never forget the look on his face. He pointed to the floor. There were footprints, muddy footprints, leading from the far corner of the basement all the way to the stairs. My dad followed them, shining the light around. The prints led to the small window near the ceiling. The window was open, just barely, but enough for someone to squeeze through. My dad slammed it shut, but before we left, he checked the crawl space under the stairs, just in case. That's when we found him. A man, dirty, thin, and wild-eyed, was curled up in the crawl space, hiding behind some boxes. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days. He didn't say a word as my dad yelled for my mum to call the police. I just stood there, numb, unable to move or even comprehend what was happening. The police arrived a few minutes later and arrested him. They said he had likely been living in our basement for days, sneaking in and out through the window when we weren't home. He must have been watching us, waiting for the right time to make his move. To this day, I still get chills thinking about how long he had been down there, watching, listening to us go about our lives, completely unaware that someone else was living in the shadows of our home. We moved out shortly after that, and I haven't stepped foot in a basement since. I used to live in a small one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the nicest place, but it was quiet, and the rent was cheap, the kind of place where people mostly kept to themselves. Looking back, I guess that's what made it easy for someone like him to slip through unnoticed. It was a Wednesday night when it happened. I remember because I'd just come home from a long shift at work, and all I wanted to do was crash on the couch. I was halfway through making dinner when I heard a knock on my door. It was strange because I wasn't expecting anyone, and I didn't really know my neighbours well enough for a casual visit. I hesitated for a second, then walked over to the door and looked through the peephole. There was a man standing there, maybe in his mid-30s, wearing a utility company uniform. It looked official. He had a dark blue jacket, a clipboard in his hand, and a lanyard around his neck. He knocked again, and then spoke through the door. "Sir, we're from the electric company. We've been having some issues in the area, and I need to check your circuit breaker." It wasn't unusual to see utility workers around the complex, but something about this felt off. Maybe it was the time. This was after 8 p.m, which seemed a little late for someone to be going door to door about maintenance issues, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I asked him through the door if he had any ID, and he held up a badge to the peephole. It looked legit, but I couldn't make out any details. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and opened it just enough to talk to him. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Don't worry, this will only take a minute. I just need to check your breaker panel." I figured if he was really from the electric company, I didn't want to be the one standing in his way and potentially end up with no power, so I let him in. He walked past me into the apartment, glancing around in a way that made me uncomfortable, but I shrugged it off. I led him to the small closet where the circuit breaker was. He knelt down, fiddling with the panel while I stood in the kitchen, awkwardly watching. After a few minutes, I realized something was wrong. He wasn't doing anything. He just kept glancing around the apartment like he was more interested in my stuff than the breaker. That's when my stomach sank. I noticed that he wasn't carrying any tools, not even a simple voltage tester. His clipboard, it was completely blank. No paperwork, no notes, nothing. My pulse started to quicken as I slowly put the pieces together. This guy wasn't here to check anything. I cleared my throat, trying to sound casual, even though my voice came out shaky. "So, what kind of issue are you checking for exactly?" He stood up slowly, that fake smile plastered on his face again, but now it looked more like a grin. "Oh, nothing major," he said, taking a step toward me. "Just routine." I felt my heart racing. There was something wrong, something very wrong. I was about to tell him to leave when he reached into his jacket. Before I could react, he pulled out a knife, the blade gleaming under the dim kitchen light. My body froze. "Here's the deal," he said, his voice low and calm. "You're going to stay nice and quiet while I take whatever I want. Understand?" I nodded, my throat too dry to respond. He waved the knife toward the living room, motioning for me to sit on the couch. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out, but the fear paralyzed me. I couldn't move, couldn't think straight. He rummaged through my drawers, grabbing my wallet, my phone, whatever small valuables he could find. But then something changed. He wasn't just robbing me. He was taking his time, watching me closely, and I could feel his eyes lingering on me in a way that made my skin crawl. That's when I realized this wasn't going to end with him just taking my stuff and leaving. I knew I had to do something. As he turned his back to search the kitchen drawers, I quietly slid off the couch, inching toward the front door. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. I grabbed the doorknob, and in one quick motion, I threw the door open and sprinted down the hallway. I didn't look back. I could hear his footsteps behind me, pounding against the floor, but I didn't stop. I ran to the neighbor's apartment and started banging on their door, screaming for help. Just as the door opened, I saw the man stop in the hallway, glaring at me for a moment before bolting down the stairs and out of the building. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, he was long gone. They took my statement and told me I was lucky. Apparently, this guy had been posing as a utility worker for weeks, targeting people in different neighborhoods. He would gain their trust, get inside their homes, and rob them. Sometimes it didn't stop there. The officer told me that in a few cases, his victims had been found tied up, or worse. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see his face, that grin, and the knife in his hand. The police never caught him, and I moved out of that apartment a month later. I still get paranoid every time I hear a knock on my door. I keep the chain locked and I never open it without double checking who's on the other side. Looking back, I realize how easily I could have been another statistic, just another name on a list of unsolved home invasions. That man wasn't just an imposter, he was a predator, and I was his prey. You never think something like this will happen to you. You hear about home invasions on the news or in movies, but it always feels distant, like some terrible thing that happens to other people. That was until it happened to us. It was a Friday night, like any other. My family and I, my wife Emily, our 2 kids, Ethan and Lily, were all settled in the living room. The kids were watching some animated movie, and Emily and I were half watching, half chatting about the weekend. It was the kind of night where everything felt peaceful, safe. I remember it so clearly because of how fast everything changed. We heard a loud crash from the back of the house. It wasn't the kind of noise you mistake for something else. It was glass, shattering. My first thought was that maybe one of the kids had left a window open and the wind blew something over. But when I turned toward the sound, my blood went cold. 2 men burst through the back door, wearing black ski masks and holding guns. I don't know if I've ever felt fear like that before or since. Everything froze for a second. Time slowed down, and it was like my brain couldn't process what was happening. The TV still blared in the background, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. Before I could even react, one of the men was on me. He pointed the gun right in my face and shouted for me to get on the floor. I don't remember what he looked like beyond the mask, but I'll never forget his eyes, cold and wild at the same time. Emily screamed, and the kids started crying, but there was nothing I could do. I dropped to my knees, my hands up, trying to protect my family in any way I could, even if that meant doing exactly what these men said. The second man grabbed Emily and threw her down on the couch. He was yelling, demanding money, valuables, anything we had. I was shaking, trying to explain that we didn't have much, just some cash, maybe a few electronics, but that only seemed to make them angrier. One of them tied my hands with duct tape, then did the same to Emily. I could see Ethan and Lily huddled together on the other side of the couch, too scared to move. Ethan, he's only 8, was trying to be brave for his little sister, holding her and whispering to her, but I could see the terror in his eyes. The men started ransacking the house, tossing drawers, smashing things, looking for a safe or more valuables. But they weren't just after our stuff. There was something about the way they moved, the way they kept looking at us, like they were playing with us, enjoying the power they had over us. I had no idea what they were capable of or what they'd do next. And that's when I felt true helplessness, realizing that these men held all the control and there was nothing I could do to stop them. Then, something happened that I'll never be able to fully explain. Amid the chaos, Ethan slipped out of the living room. I didn't notice at first, too distracted by the men tearing through our things, but then I caught a glimpse of him through the doorway. He was crawling on his hands and knees, so quietly that even I almost missed it. I wanted to scream for him to come back, but the words died in my throat. I was terrified they'd see him. He disappeared down the hall, and I could only hope and pray that he was doing something, anything, to get help. Meanwhile, one of the men grabbed me by the collar and pulled me into the kitchen, demanding to know if we had a safe. I stammered out a no, trying to stay calm, but I could see the frustration building in his eyes. That's when we heard it, the faint sound of police sirens in the distance. The men froze. They looked at each other, then back at us. One of them cursed under his breath and sprinted to the front door, peeking through the blinds. I could feel the shift in the air, the panic starting to set in for them. "What the hell did you do?" one of them shouted at me, but I had no idea what was happening. I hadn't called the police. I couldn't. My hands were still bound, and I hadn't moved from the spot they threw me in. Suddenly, the man in the living room stormed back in, gun raised, and that's when I saw him. Ethan. My heart nearly stopped. He was standing just behind the couch, holding my phone in his hands. One of the men lunged at him, but Ethan, quick thinking as ever, darted into the hallway and slammed the bedroom door shut behind him. The sirens were getting louder, closer. Panic took over the intruders. They knew they were running out of time. The two men cursed and made a run for it, bolting through the back door the same way they came in. A few minutes later, the police arrived, and I've never felt such a rush of relief in my life. They cut us loose, and all I could think about was how close we came to something far worse. When I finally got to Ethan, he was curled up in our bedroom closet, still holding the phone. His hands were shaking, but he was okay. I don't know how he had the courage to do what he did, to sneak away, call for help, and hide while those men were still in the house. That little boy saved our lives. The police told us later that the men were part of a group that had been targeting houses in the area for weeks. They'd watch the families, learn their routines, and then strike when they least expected it. The thought that they had been watching us, planning this whole thing, made me sick. They caught them a few hours later, not far from our neighborhood. It's been years since that night, but I still think about it sometimes, about how easily things could have gone differently, about how brave my son was, and about how, even in the safety of your own home, you're never as secure as you think you are.